When I was 9 years old, my dad had an organ in our house, a small one. And I learned only one song on the organ, Just As I Am. And it was very simple. It didn't sound like that. But I then got introduced to a football, and I never learned another song. Well, I don't think we've sung that song in the 10 years I've been here. I think that's the first time. I grew up listening to that song when I was a kid. So it kind of took me back. So thank you, Jeffrey. This morning, we are starting a new series. So if you have your Bible, if you would open to the book of 1 Samuel. 1 Samuel chapter 1. And this morning we're going to be in verses 1 to 8. Starting a brand new series. We have spent the past 9 months in the book of Philippians. And this morning we're starting a new series. And then if you're visiting with us this morning, the way that we do things is that I like to preach through an entire book. And then we usually swap between Old Testament and New Testament, though not always. And I don't plan to go through 2 Samuel when I finish the series, simply because we would be in it for quite some time. Though we may go through that book at some point in the future. I plan, Lord willing, to be in this book in 1 Samuel over the next 1 to 2 years, probably closer to the 2-year mark. And so looking forward to preaching once again through Old Testament narrative. 1 Samuel is filled with theology and redemptive, salvific historical narrative. And so really looking forward to preaching this. I hope you are as well. So let's read the text. I'll open us in a word of prayer, and then we will jump into the sermon this morning. 1 Samuel chapter 1, beginning in verse 1. There was a certain man of Ramatim Sophim of the hill country of Ephraim, whose name was Elkanah, the son of Yoraham, son of Elihu, son of Tohu, son of Zuph, an Ephrathite. He had 2 wives. The name of the one was Hannah, and the name of the other was Peninnah. And Peninnah had children, but Hannah had no children. Now this man used to go up year by year from his city to worship and to sacrifice to the Lord of hosts at Shiloh, where the 2 sons of Eli, Hophni and Phinehas, were priests of the Lord. On the day when Elkanah sacrificed, he would give portions to Peninnah, his wife, and to all her sons and daughters. But to Hannah he gave a double portion because he loved her, though the Lord had closed her womb. And her rival used to provoke her grievously to irritate her because the Lord had closed her womb. So it went on year by year. As often as she went up to the house of the Lord, she used to provoke her. Therefore Hannah wept and would not eat. And Elkanah, her husband, said to her, Hannah, why do you weep? And why do you not eat? And why is your heart sad? Am I not more to you than 10 sons? And we'll stop right there. If you will, pray with me. Lord, I pray, as we begin this series, Lord, I pray that over the next 1 to 2 years, that you would deeply and richly teach us from your word. God, as we work our way through these characters and see your faithfulness, God, in their lives, that you would help us to remember that you are the same yesterday, today, and forever, that you have not changed, that all the things that you did 3,000 years ago, you are still doing today. And I pray, God, that you help us to remember that and to look to you the same way that we see these characters look to you, God. Increase our faith, God, in you through this book. I pray in Jesus' name. Amen. The very first command that God gives to humans is this: be fruitful and multiply. It's the very first command that God gives humanity. Now, certainly God's will is not for everyone to be fruitful and multiply, at least not in the physical sense. Both Jesus and Paul affirm that many are called to be single, and even that singleness is in some ways better than marriage. But for those who do marry, the question is, why would God keep them from the ability to carry out the very first divine command that he gives? About 15% of married couples cannot get pregnant. It's about 1 in 7 marriages. Why? I was looking up, what does the world say are the reasons for infertility? We'll get things like age, endometriosis, environmental factors, certain cancers. But even with all of our medical advancements, things such as heart transplants, even we can do a face transplant now. In utero surgery, we can do surgery on a fetus inside the mother's womb. Even with all of our medical advancements, about 1 in 4 infertile couples will never know why they can't get pregnant. There's no explanation. And of course, many doctors will claim there's no such thing as unexplained infertility. They would claim there must be a medical explanation. We just don't know what it is. Now, that statement is true, except we need to take out one word. There must be an explanation. There may not be a medical explanation. We want to believe that there are explanations for all of our pain in this world. If we are single and marriage has just not worked out for us, there must be an explanation. If we are married and we get pregnant and then miscarry, there must be an explanation. If we have a child and our child gets a rare disorder and is paralyzed for the rest of his or her life, there must be an explanation. If someone we love dies unexpectedly, there must be an explanation. But sometimes the explanation goes no further than God. It is true that God ordains and he uses secondary causes, but the Bible teaches us that God is the ultimate cause of all of our pain. It's the title of the sermon this morning. God is the ultimate cause of all of our pain. And we'll see that in the story this morning. Now, since we are starting a new book, let me start off with some background information. I do this whenever we start a new series, so you know what's going on. Let's start off with some background information. Let's start with the author. The author of 1st and 2nd Samuel is unknown. Many assume that Samuel is the author because that's what the book's called, is 1st and 2nd Samuel. But being that his death is mentioned in 1 Samuel 25, he couldn't have written much of the book. So for the duration of the sermon series, in hereafter today, I will refer to the author as the narrator. We'll just call him the narrator. It's interesting that the books of 1st and 2nd Samuel are called 1st and 2nd Samuel because they're really not about Samuel all that much. They're really about David. You almost think we should call them 1st and 2nd David. Genre. 1st and 2nd Samuel were originally one book. All right, we only separated them many years later. In the Hebrew Bible, it was originally part of the early prophets, the former prophets. But we'll consider this genre as historical narrative. All right, this is history. We don't believe this is a story that somebody made up. All of this is real human history that actually happened. Everything in this book actually happened in history. Date. The book begins sometime in the 11th century BC. Sometime in the 11th century BC. The book, 1 Samuel, ends with the death of Saul, which is around 1010 BC. So all of 1 Samuel, everything that we're going to go through over the next 1 to 2 years, happens in less than 100 years. Give or take, anywhere from 50 to 100 years. People. We're going to be introduced to several figures in this book. Hannah, that's who we're looking at this morning. Eli, Samuel, Saul, Jonathan, David, Abigail, a giant, and a witch. In these first 8 verses, we are introduced to 6 characters in this story, and we'll be introduced to many more. And then finally, the setting. We had started the book of Judges 2 years ago. Preached through that book. We finished it a little less than a year ago. And where Judges left off, where we left off that book a year ago, that is where 1 Samuel picks up. 1 Samuel picks up right where Judges left off. Now, where did Judges leave off? In those days, there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. And that's where we left off, and that's where we pick up. And that statement by the narrator of Judges is really a defining statement, not only for the book of Judges, but also for the nation of Israel as a whole. Why? Because 1 Samuel is going to tell us, how did Israel get a king? In those days, there was no king. How did they get a king? And that's what 1 Samuel is going to answer in part for us. So that's the background of the book. Let's start off with an exposition of the text. Let's look at verse 1. There was a certain man of Ramathaim Zophim of the hill country of Ephraim, whose name was Elkanah, the son of Yoraham, the son of Elihu, son of Tohu, son of Zuph, an Ephrathite. Now, like true biblical fashion, we're introduced to a certain man with no context. In verse 1, we're told 3 things about this man. Number 1, we're told his name, Elkanah. Elkanah means God has redeemed, or God has possessed. 2, we're told that he's an Ephrathite, which means that he's of the tribe of Ephraim. And 3, we're told his genealogy. He's the son of Yoraham, the son of Elihu, son of Tohu, son of Zuph. Now, this genealogy presents a problem for us, because if we trace Elkanah's genealogy back, we find that he descends from the tribe of Levi, not the tribe of Ephraim. So how do we reconcile that? Several proposals have been given to reconcile this, but the most satisfactory answer of this is that he resided in Ephraim, but his genealogy was from Levi. This is no different than if you were to say that you were an American. Well, that refers to your nationality or where you live. And if you were to say that you are Asian or African or European, that would refer to your genealogy. That's all that biblical writers are doing here. Now, this is important because that means that Elkanah is a Levite. And therefore, Samuel is a Levite. Remember, the Levites were set apart to God. Verse 2, he had 2 wives. We learn one more piece of information about Elkanah, that he had 2 wives. Now, we do not have time to get into a full-blown theological discussion of polygamy. I'm sure you would love that. So for time's sake, let me give my best summary statement about polygamy. This is my best summary statement about polygamy. Polygamy was a practice that God allowed as a concession in the Old Testament due to man's weakness, but was not part of his original design, and it always had consequences. Let me say that again. It's a mouthful. Polygamy was a practice that God allowed as a concession in the Old Testament due to man's weakness, but was not part of his original design, and it always had consequences. Let me give you some examples. Remember Abraham and his two wives, Sarah and Hagar? Drastic consequences. Remember Jacob and his two wives, Rachel and Leah? They get into a birthing battle. Remember Gideon and his many wives? And he had 70 sons. What happened to those 70 sons? Abimelech killed them all. Drastic consequences. And remember Solomon, who had 700 wives and 300 concubines, who turned his heart away from the Lord. And even in this story, we see that polygamy had drastic consequences for Hannah. Now, with these two wives, we're told two pieces of information about each. Number one, their names. Hannah. Hannah means grace or graciousness. Peninnah, we don't know. It probably means coral or ruby or pearl. My best guess is ruby or pearl, based on what I read. The fact that Hannah is named first would seem to suggest that she was Elkanah's first wife. Two, we're told their status as a mother. Notice Hannah is named first and then Peninnah, but then Peninnah is named first and then Hannah. Why? Because Peninnah had children and Hannah had none. And notice the plural here. Peninnah had children, plural, and Hannah had none. My guess is that Elkanah took Hannah as his wife, tried for many years to have children, and when she couldn't bear any children, he took Peninnah as his second wife in the hopes of having children. That's why he has two wives. Now, we probably as 21st century people, especially 21st century people living in Seattle, Washington, and the United States of America, we probably cannot feel the full weight of this statement, Hannah had no children. We probably can't feel the full weight of that statement. Barrenness was seen as a curse in ancient Israel. We can see it in the comments that women made. Rachel said, God has taken away my reproach. Elizabeth said, thus the Lord has done for me to take away my reproach among people. Isaiah 4:1, 7 women shall take hold of one man in that day, saying, take away our reproach. A woman who was barren in ancient Israel was a disappointment to her husband, to her family, and certainly to herself. The only similar experience that I can give you is this. Let's say that your parents sacrificed everything for you to go to a prestigious college. They sacrificed their country, their home, their savings, their comfort. They sacrificed everything they have to send you to a prestigious college. And you go, you get to go. And over those 4 years, you work your tail off. And at the end of those 4 years, your parents expect you to get a prestigious job. But at the end of those 4 years, not only can you not get a prestigious job, you can't even get a job. You go year after year after year not being able to get a job. And every Thanksgiving, every Christmas, every family dinner, your family asks you, hey, why aren't you working? Your brother got a job at Microsoft. Why didn't you? Your cousin is working at Google. Why aren't you working? That's how barrenness felt to a woman in ancient Israel. Verse 3. Now this man used to go up year by year from his city to worship and to sacrifice to the Lord of hosts at Shiloh, where the two sons of Eli and Hophni and Phinehas were priests of the Lord. Now Elkanah was a man who kept the Torah. God had said in Deuteronomy 16:16, 3 times a year, all your males shall appear before the Lord your God at the place that he will choose. Now we know from Judges 18:31 that the house of God at this time is in Shiloh. It doesn't get moved to Jerusalem until David. David is the one who moves it to Jerusalem. I want you to notice this little phrase here. It's very easy to gloss over. The Lord of hosts. This is the first of 242 times where God is called the Lord of hosts. God will certainly show himself to be the Lord of hosts in this book. And here we're introduced to 3 new characters, Eli, Hophni, and Phinehas. Now, just as a side note, this is not the same Phinehas as Aaron's grandson in Exodus and Numbers. 2 different Phinehas. Eli is going to reappear several times in chapters 1 to 4. Hophni and Phinehas, they really have insignificant roles in the story. They simply serve to highlight their folly, their rebellion, and consequently their death. Eli was the priest, but presumably because of his age, because now he's in his old age, his sons now are the active duty priests. Though we'll find out in due time, they are actually quite wicked priests. Verses 4 to 5. On the day when Elkanah sacrificed, he would give portions to Peninnah, his wife, and to all her sons and daughters. But to Hannah, he gave a double portion because he loved her, though the Lord had closed her womb. Now, when the Israelites made sacrifices, some sacrifices were to be entirely consumed on the altar. They were to be wholly, completely consumed. You were not to eat of it. But other sacrifices, God actually allowed. He actually even commanded them to enjoy it, to eat part of it, to eat part of the meat. Now, that may not mean a lot to us, but to them it did, because meat was a luxury in ancient Israel. They didn't eat meat every day like we do. You might go weeks, maybe even months sometimes without eating meat. So when they would make this sacrifice, this was a joyous time. And whenever Elkanah would make sacrifices, he would give portions to Peninnah. And not only to her, but he also would give portions to her sons and her daughters. Again, the narrator is highlighting she had multiple children, sons and daughters. But to Hannah, he gave a double portion. Why? Because he loved her, though the Lord had closed her womb. Now, several questions and comments are in order here. Number 1, does this mean that Elkanah loved Hannah and not Peninnah? That's possible. It's also possible that the narrator is simply highlighting the fact that Hannah was his favorite. But in the case of Rachel and Leah, the Lord saw that Rachel was loved and that Leah was unloved. You could even translate it as hated on the Hebrew word. So I'm inclined to believe that Elkanah loved Hannah and Peninnah may simply have been a means to an end. 2, what's interesting is that this is the same scenario as Rachel and Leah. The wife who is unloved is fertile, and the wife who is loved is barren. Number 3, you may have a footnote in your Bible there. If you see that footnote, we would get way too technical to explain this footnote and why the footnote is there and what it means. But the reason for it is that the Septuagint is the Greek translation of the Old Testament. In the Septuagint, they translated this verse as such. And although he loved Hannah, he would give Hannah only one portion because the Lord had closed her womb. Now that would make sense because she doesn't need extra portions because she's just one person. He would only give her one portion because she doesn't have any kids. But I think the Septuagint is wrong. I agree with how the ESV translates this here. All right. Number 4, the Lord actively and intentionally closed Hannah's womb. This is maybe the most important statement in all of chapter 1. God is the one who opens and closes the womb. Not science. Not Mother Nature. Not sex. But God. Behold, now the Lord has prevented me from bearing children. Sarah, Genesis 16:2. For the Lord had closed all the wombs of the house of Abimelech, Genesis 20:18. When the Lord saw that Leah was hated, he opened her womb, but Rachel was barren, Genesis 29:31. Then God remembered Rachel, and God listened to her and opened her womb, Genesis 30:22. Shall I, who caused to bring forth, shut the womb, says your God, Isaiah 66:9. What is the explanation for Hannah's barrenness? God is the explanation. God is. Verse 6. And her rival used to provoke her grievously to irritate her because the Lord had closed her womb. Verse 6 sounds like one of those reality TV shows, doesn't it? Like or maybe like a soap opera of the worst kind. The narrator doesn't even use Peninnah's name here. He just calls her rival. Probably more accurately translated, her rival wife. Her rival wife used to provoke her. The word for provoke there, it's the same word used all throughout the Old Testament in Hebrew to refer to the Israelites provoking God to anger. Same exact word. It means to provoke to irritation, to provoke to anger, provoke to rage, to vex. And not only did she provoke her, but she provoked her grievously. Now, some translations do not bring out the severity of this provocation, like the NIV. The NIV says she kept provoking her. But we should read this as the ESV, provoke her grievously, or the NASB, provoke her bitterly, or as the NRSV, provoke her severely. And Peninnah, she doesn't do this out of ignorance. It's not like she's just oblivious to Hannah's pain and she does, make some kind of comments. Sometimes like your mom will make comments to you and you're like, oh, she's just oblivious to like how she comes across. That's not what she's doing here. Peninnah does this intentionally. The narrator says that she did it purposely to irritate Hannah. And she provoked her in the most mean-spirited way possible. You know how there are blows and then there are low blows? Peninnah hits below the belt. She provoked Hannah because the Lord had closed her womb. Meaning the content of her provocation is directly tied to her barrenness. And you know what makes this worse? You know what adds insult to injury? There's nothing Hannah can do about this. It would be one thing if Peninnah provoked her that her cooking was not that great. If Peninnah said, Elkanah loves my cooking better than yours, Hannah. Well, okay. Then Hannah can go work on her cooking skills. But there's nothing Hannah can do to open her womb. There's nothing she can do. Verse 7. So it went on year by year. As often as she went up to the house of the Lord, she used to provoke her. Therefore Hannah wept and would not eat. So Peninnah is provoking Hannah. She's provoking her severely. She's intentionally provoking her severely to irritate her. She's intentionally provoking her severely to irritate her about the most sensitive subject matter in her life, something she has no control over, and Hannah simply has to listen to it year after year after year after year. How many years did this go on? 3? 5? 10? 15? As often as she went up to the house of the Lord, she used to provoke her. 3 times every year, year after year. And we can only imagine what the comments must have been like, right? Hey, Hannah, I know you got a double portion. If you can't eat it all, my kids will help with your leftovers. Hey, Hannah, I sure wish I got a double portion of meat. I guess I'll just have to settle for a double portion of children. We can only imagine the comments. Therefore, Hannah would weep and would not eat. It's almost as if the double portion is a reminder. It's a reminder that she doesn't have any children. And she doesn't want to eat this reminder. She weeps, not only because the Lord has closed her womb, but also because Peninnah has opened her wound. Verse 8, Elkanah, her husband, said to her, Hannah, why do you weep? And why do you not eat? And why is your heart sad? Am I not more to you than 10 sons? Men being insensitive to their wives' emotions is not a new phenomenon. It's as old as the Bible. Elkanah's comments are insensitive on 3 accounts. Number 1, I assume he is partially to blame for this. I assume that he took Peninnah as his wife to have children. He should have done as Zechariah did with Elizabeth. He should have been joyful with the wife that God had given him, barren or not. 2, his comments suggest that Hannah should just get over her sadness. But notice he got what he wanted. He wanted children. He got what he wanted. But he's completely insensitive to what she wanted. And 3, his comments seem to suggest that he is enough for Hannah. He points her to himself rather than to God. What should Elkanah have said instead? Perhaps he should have done what Isaac did. And Isaac prayed to the Lord for his wife because she was barren. Next week, we're going to see that's exactly what Hannah does, is pray. All right, that's our exposition of the text. Application, I have 3 truths about God and our pain. 3 truths about God and our pain. Number 1, which is the title of the sermon, God is the ultimate cause of our pain. God is the ultimate cause of our pain. Now, we certainly don't have time to discuss and to devote to a robust discussion of causality. If you take a theology course, a philosophy course, you'll get into some deep discussions of causality and how causality works. But there are certain texts in scriptures where the biblical writers say clearly and unequivocally that God is the ultimate cause of a person's pain. All the pain in your life, all the suffering, all the affliction, every sadness, every tear, every depression, all of your pain and mine, God is the ultimate cause of it. This is very clear in the Bible. This is no clearer than in the book of Job. 5 different characters in the book of Job attribute Job's pain to God. 5 different characters. Let me show this to you very quickly. Number 1, Satan. 2 times Satan says to the Lord, stretch out your hand. Notice Satan doesn't say, God, let me stretch out my hand. Satan says, stretch out your hand, God. 2, the servant. He says, the fire of God fell from heaven. The fire of God. 3, Job. Job says, the Lord gave and the Lord takes away. He says, shall we receive good from the Lord and shall we not receive evil? 4, Job's wife. Job's wife tells him, curse God and die. Not curse Satan and die. Curse God and die. Even Job's wife in all her folly recognizes this is from the Lord. And 5, the narrator at the end of the book. And they showed him sympathy and comforted him, Job's friends, for all the evil that the Lord had brought upon him. And here in this chapter, the narrator tells us clearly and unequivocally that the Lord had closed her womb. What was the source of Hannah's pain? Her barrenness. Why is she barren? It's not because of a medical reason. Even if it is because of a medical reason, that would not be the ultimate reason. It's not because they're not sleeping together. Elkanah loved Hannah. It's not because of her diet. She gets a double portion of meat. She is barren because the Lord had closed her womb. The narrator repeats it twice, once in verse 5 and then again in verse 6. God is the ultimate cause of all of our pain. Now, we might say, maybe you're sitting there thinking, is that just a theological point? Okay, God is the ultimate cause of my pain. Thank you very much. What else you got? How is that supposed to be helpful? And I think the answer lies in verse 3 and this little phrase tucked away, the Lord of hosts. The Lord of hosts. Because when we are in pain, suffering, affliction, trials, sorrow, distress, I need to know if the God I serve, is he or is he not the Lord of hosts? I need to know. If I don't believe that God is the ultimate cause of closing the womb, I probably will struggle to believe that God is able and willing to open the womb. If I don't believe that God is the ultimate cause of ordaining cancer, I probably will struggle to believe that God is able and willing to heal cancer. This is not just a theological point. This has real practical implications for what we believe God is able and willing to do. If you don't believe that God is the ultimate cause of your pain, you probably struggle to believe that God is willing to work a miracle in your life. And if you believe that God is the ultimate cause of your pain, if God is not the ultimate cause, where else are we going to turn? You're going to blame Mother Nature? You going to take it up with Satan? Where else are we going to turn? Who else can we plead our case to? Where can I turn if it's not to God? 2, God sometimes not only causes the wound, but also allows salt to be poured into the wound. Barrenness was so painful and was so shameful for a woman in ancient Israel that no one would dare say something hurtful to a barren woman, right? A barren woman in ancient Israel was so painful and so shameful that no one would dare ever say something hurtful to a barren woman, right? And her rival used to provoke her grievously to irritate her because the Lord had closed her womb. Not only did God close Hannah's womb, but he also allowed Peninnah to open her wound. Why did God make Abraham and Sarah wait 75 and 65 years for a child, give them a promise, tell them they will have a child, and then make them wait another 25 years? Why did God, after Jacob had been separated from his family for 20 years, he is away from his mother, and on the way back, God sees fit to give him a permanent limp? Why did God have Joseph be betrayed by the people who are supposed to love him the most and get sold into slavery, but when he gets sold into slavery, only to then be delivered wrongfully to prison? Why did God protect Moses as a baby, raise him up and allow him to live, allow him to be a shepherd 40 years, only for him to go from shepherding sheep to shepherding donkeys? Why did God allow Satan to kill Job's 10 children, take away all his possessions, and then allow Satan to afflict him with painful boils all over his body? Why did God make Ezekiel do seemingly ridiculous prophecies, like lying on his side for a year and cooking his food over dung, and then tell him, your wife is going to die and you may not mourn for her, just keep prophesying? Why did God cause Paul to suffer for his name's sake and then see fit to give him a thorn in the flesh while he suffers? Why did God not only close Hannah's womb, but also allow Peninnah to open her most painful wound? God could stop this. He could shut Peninnah's mouth. He struck Zechariah mute. He could shut her mouth. He could put her children to death. You want to taunt my chosen one? He could put all of her children to death. He could appear to Elkanah and tell him, rebuke your wife Peninnah. But as far as we know, God doesn't do any of this. God not only closes Hannah's womb, but God ultimately opens her wound and ordains that a yearly dose of salt be poured into it. Why? Why? Because God will do whatever it takes to drive us to him. Next week, we are going to see that Hannah's pain drives her to her knees. It is in deep distress that she meets the Lord of hosts in prayer. Perhaps Peninnah was a thorn in her flesh to cause the woman whose name means grace to rely upon the source of all grace. Friend, God will do whatever it takes in your life and in my life to drive us to him. There is no amount of pain. There is no amount of pain that God will stop at to drive us to him. Three, God has a purpose in our pain. God has a purpose in our pain. God's purpose in making Sarah barren and making them wait 100 years and 90 years respectively was to show the miracle of Isaac, was to show that the promise of God will not fail. God's purpose of making Rebekah barren was to show that God listens to prayer and to give them Jacob and Esau through that prayer. God's purpose in making Rachel barren was to give them Joseph and Benjamin and leading them to the Exodus. God's purpose in making Manoah's wife barren was to give them Samson, to deliver them from the Philistines. God's purpose in making Zechariah and Elizabeth barren was to give them John the Baptist, to prepare the way for the Messiah. And God has a purpose in making Hannah barren. She doesn't know what it is yet, but we do. We know that God has a purpose for this. Time can function like darkness. The longer it gets, the darker it gets. God allowed Hannah's pain to continue for years. At least long enough for Peninnah to have several children. So I don't think it's like 2 years. I think it's a long time. And this is the type of pain that Hannah can't get away from. You know how when you're in pain, sometimes you just run away, you move cities, you change jobs, you change relationships, you just get away from the pain. She can't get away from this pain. Every infant cry in the middle of the night, every little girl's giggle, every sword fight with sticks between brothers, every look of delight on Elkanah's face playing with his children, all of it would be a constant reminder of her pain. One of the hardest parts of pain and suffering, maybe the hardest, is believing that God has a purpose in it. That it's not meaningless. Friend, God not only has a purpose, he has a good purpose. How we wish that we could sit and read our story and see all the connections in one sitting. How I wish that I could read 1st and 2nd Matthew. And as I read it, I could be like, oh, well, that was doing this and this was doing this. And oh, how we wish that we could read that. But we don't get to read that story until heaven. God is pleased to cultivate desperation in us. He is pleased to cultivate dependence in us. He is pleased to cultivate trust in us. God is the ultimate cause of our pain. And therefore, the Lord of hosts is the ultimate healing to our pain.